Hello, this is the first in a set of video lessons on equations, and in this video lesson we are going to be looking at solving one-step equations. Okay, so we're going to start off, before we look at any equations at all, I want to look at this idea of inverse. Now the word inverse sort of means opposite. So in maths there are four basic operations, so those are plus, minus, multiply, and divide. And each of those has an inverse, the opposite of it. So the inverse of adding, the opposite of adding is subtracting, right? The inverse of subtracting, then, is adding. So these two are the opposite of each other. And similarly, if I multiplied something, the opposite of multiplying is dividing. And you might see where this is going. The opposite of dividing, the inverse of dividing, is multiplying. So what does that mean? So if we look at these two here, adding and subtracting, we've said that those are inverses of each other. That means if I did 5 plus 2, I know that the answer is 7. So if I wanted to undo that, if I wanted to go backwards, I'd need to do the inverse. So I'd write 7 minus 2 equals 5. And I've got back to where I started, right? I started at 5, I added on 2, and I got 7. I want to do the inverse, so I'm going to have to do the opposite, that's taking away. So I started at this 7, I took away the 2 instead of adding it, and now I've ended up back where I started at 5, because I've done the opposite. We could do the same thing with multiplying and dividing, just so we can see what I mean there. So let's say I do 3 times 4, and the answer is 12. If I wanted to undo that, if I wanted to go backwards to get back to where I started, I would start with my 12, and instead of multiplying by 4, I'd do the opposite. I'd divide by 4. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. So once again, I've got back to where I started. 3 multiplied by 4 is 12. So if I do the inverse, 12 divided by 4 is 3. Okay, that's going to be useful in just a little minute. One more thing before we get started on any actual equations is just a wee thing about notation. So in maths and in equations in particular, we often use letters to represent numbers. So I might use the letter X, and if I did that, I might sometimes see in front of that letter X a number, 3 for instance. And what that means is, if I write 3x like that, it means 3 multiplied by x. So this x here is standing for a number. We don't know what it is yet. But whatever that number is that x is representing, we're going to multiply it by 3. So 3 next to an x, that means 3 multiplied by x. And one other thing that I'd like us to know is if we see 3 over x, we should write like that. What that means is 3 divided by x. So whatever this x is, I'm going to take my 3 and I'm going to divide it by x. Okay, so if we see a number and a letter together like this with no sign in between them, that means we're multiplying those things. We don't bother to write the times sign. Partly because it's just a little bit faster, and partly because it can get a little bit confusing, because this multiplication sign looks a little bit like an X, so let's not have that confusion, let's just leave it out entirely. And this one here, this line here, this dividing line, sort of like a fraction line, that tells me that we're dividing these things. So I start with a 3 that's on top, and I divide it by this X. Okay, now we've looked at that, let's look at some equations. I've got this equation here. The equation says x plus 7 equals 13, and we are asked to solve that. Now, all it's asking us to do is find out what is the value of x. So what do we know? We know that x is a number. We don't know what number yet, but we know when I take that number and add on 7 to it, the answer I get should be 13. So basically what we're saying is something plus 7 equals 13, and we want to know what is that something. So we talked a little bit ago about inverses, didn't we? So I'm going to have to do the inverse of adding 7. And what is the inverse of adding 7? Well, it's subtracting 7, isn't it? So I'm going to have to subtract 7, and I'm going to do the same to both sides. I'm going to write it like this. Because over here, I had an x and a 7, but I'm going to take away that 7. So now all I've got is an x. On this side, I had 13, but I'm taking away 7. So we need to do 13, take away 7, and that gives me the answer 6. And that is the solution to my equation. Something plus 7 equals 13. What's that something? It must have been 6, because 6 plus 7 is 13. Okay, another example. We've got y minus 4 equals 11. So something, take away 4, equals 11. We are asked to solve that, so that means we're going to need to find the value of y. Let's first of all look at what is the opposite of subtracting 4. The opposite of subtracting 4 is adding 4. Adding 4. Good. So I had this y, I took away 4, but now I'm adding 4 back on, so we get back to where we started, we get back to y. And we've got 11 plus 4. 11 plus 4 is 15. So that is my answer. There's my solution. Y must be 15. Y take away 4 is 11. Well, that must mean y is 15, because 15 take away 4 is 11. Okay, just a few more examples. This time we've got 3a is equal to 15. And we said before, didn't we? I'm just going to write this out in a slightly different way. We said before that 3a, the 3 just next to the a with no symbol in between, means 3 multiplied by a. I'm just writing that out so remember that that's what it means. So 3 multiplied by a equals 15. So we're going to need to think of what is the opposite of multiplying something by 3. What's the opposite of timesing by 3? And the opposite, the inverse, is to divide by 3, isn't it? So we're going to divide by 3. We're going to divide by 3. So over here I had 3 a's, but I'm dividing that by 3, so now I've only got 1 a. Over here, on this side, I had 15, but I need to divide by 3. 15 divided by 3 is 5. So my solution is a equals 5. 3 a's equals 15. What is a? Well, a is 5, because 3 5s are 15. Here, we've got p divided by 4 equals 6. So something, I divide it by 4, I get the answer 6. We want to work out what that something was. So what is the opposite of dividing by 4? The opposite of dividing by 4 is multiplying by 4. So I multiply on both sides. So I had this p, I've divided it by 4, but then I've undone that dividing by multiplying by 4. So we're back to where we started, we're back at p. On this side, I've got 6. I need to multiply that by 4. 6 times 4 is 24. So my answer is p equals 24. Final example. And here we've got that dividing line, right, that I showed you earlier. So again, I'll just write this out so we remember what it means. H over 2, that just means h divided by 2. Whoops. And that equals 7. So something divided by 2 equals 7. We want to know what that something is. We're asked to solve. That's what solve means. What does the letter stand for? What's it representing? So something divided by 2 is 7. What's the opposite? What's the inverse of dividing by 2? The inverse of dividing by 2 is multiplying by 2. We multiply here. We multiply here. And so, if I start with an h and I divide by 2, and then multiply by 2, then those two, I've sort of undone that, haven't I? So that's back to where we started. We've got h on this left-hand side. Over here I've got 7 times 2. 7 multiplied by 2 is going to be 14. So my answer to this question is h equals 14. Okay, great stuff.